All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 of our series here at White Hat Research and Policy Group called Democracy 101, where we're talking about the history of voting rights, particularly in Arizona, the history of voter suppression, and talking about how all this history applies to what is going on right now. My name is David Boyles. I'm the research director for White Hat Research and Policy Group, and thank you for joining me tonight. So if you were here a couple weeks ago, we did our first episode talking about the Voting Rights Act. And this is part of a 3-part series we're doing right now on the Voting Rights Act. And if you didn't catch that video, it is on our YouTube page. You can go check it out. And in that video, we talked about the history of the Voting Rights Act, what it actually did, why it was so important. And then tonight, what I want to get into is Voting Rights Act and its impacts, particularly on Arizona, because Arizona plays actually a pretty big role throughout the whole history of this act. And I think it goes right into a lot of the stuff that we see going on today at the state legislature. Literally today, literally in the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of this happening. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so tonight it's going to be just me, but I do want to take questions. So as we go through tonight, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. And at the end, we're going to get a chance. I want to go through and answer those questions. But yeah, let's go ahead and get right to it and jump in. So just a brief refresher, if you didn't catch our first video. So we're talking about the Voting Rights Act. A lot of you are probably familiar with kind of the outlines of the Voting Rights Act. It was passed in 1965 originally. This was part of, the landmark legislation that came out of the Civil Rights Movement, along with the Civil Rights Act the year before, one of the 2 big pieces of legislation. And the Voting Rights Act was passed after the march in Selma, which was, designed to bring attention to the fact that these places in, especially Alabama, Mississippi, a lot of these states, and the voter suppression that was going on there. And like we talked about, going back to the Reconstruction period, post-Civil War period, we had the 15th Amendment, which actually prohibited voter discrimination, or voter suppression, I should say, based on race. It said no one should be denied the right to vote based on race. This was intended very specifically to give the formerly enslaved people the right to vote. But then, with the federal government pulling out of the South in 1877, it was essentially not enforced for about 100 years. And the state governments throughout the South were allowed to suppress votes in all sorts of ways, though for the most part, not specifically based on race, because that was prohibited by the 15th Amendment. So they found all of these other ways to do it through literacy tests and poll taxes and, violence and intimidation at the polling places and things like that, which is what the Voting Rights Act was intended to prevent. And we talked last week about the 2 big provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Did a lot of stuff, a lot of these little provisions, but the 2 major things that the Voting Rights Act did, there was what was called Section 2, which applied to the whole country, prohibited specific practices, especially around gerrymandering, things like that, and allowed voters to bring a suit against any state law or county restriction that they felt was based on race. And then the big part of the Voting Rights Act, the part that really made it revolutionary, was Sections 4 and 5. Section 4 created this formula for identifying states, counties, cities that were being discriminatory, that had a history of discrimination. And if you fell under that Section 4 formula, then Section 5 applied to you. And Section 5 said any of those jurisdictions under that formula have to submit any changes to their voting procedures, voting laws, to the Department of Justice for what was called pre-clearance. So the Department of Justice had to sign off on any changes to make sure that they were not discriminatory. And that was the thing that really caused the Voting Rights Act to be so impactful almost immediately. Starting with the 1966 election, literally the year after it was passed, there was this huge change because of the pre-clearance provisions. And we talked about then the bill was originally designed actually to be temporary, thinking racism would go away, but it has been reauthorized most recently in 2007 with this ongoing problem of states, particularly state legislatures, trying to prevent, people they don't want to vote, typically, racial minorities, other groups they don't want to vote. And so that takes us up to what I want to talk about today. So that Section 4 formula that identified these problematic areas, there were 11 states originally that were covered either as a whole or in part, meaning certain counties. A lot of them, the usual suspects, your Alabamas, your Mississippis, places like that. But our home state, Arizona, was also included originally in part. Only a few counties were originally included in the 1965 version. But then by the reauthorization that happened in 1975, 10 years later, the whole state was covered. And we're going to talk about that tonight and kind of how we got to that point. And so let's go ahead and get into it. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is Arizona's system of trying to prevent people who do not speak English from voting. And this is really kind of the heart of the discrimination and the voter suppression that has happened typically, throughout Arizona's history. And I'm basing tonight's episode on two really great pieces of journalism I came across that I put in the show notes and recommend you check out. First one by Antonia Farzan, who's a now former writer for the Phoenix New Times. This is a piece she published in the New Times back in 2018 on the racist history of voter suppression in Arizona, and particularly on the English-only provisions that we're going to talk about. And then there was another great article in AZCentral by Grace Oldham last year, right before the 2020 election, that talked a lot about the Spanish-speaking restrictions, but also focused a lot on restrictions on Indigenous people, which we're going to talk about. So definitely check those out. And fair warning, in this first part, I'm going to be quoting a few newspaper columns from the time. I'm going to be using some racially insensitive language, and I apologize. So just going to content warning on that. But I think it's really important to read, quote this language directly, just so we know what we're talking about and what was going on. So we're going back to 1905. So this is pre-statehood era in Arizona, still in the territorial days. We're only at this point about a little over 50 years out from Arizona even being part of the U.S. Before that, of course, it was part of Mexico before the Mexican-American War. And so in 1905, the Arizona Republican newspaper, which is now the Arizona Republic, same operation, they published this editorial, and this is a quotation now. "There is a foreign element in our voting population which is both illiterate and ignorant of our institutions. This element is neither Democratic nor Republican. It is for sale, openly and notoriously for sale." And if you didn't quite pick up on what they were implying there, just a few days after this editorial was published, another one came out to clarify exactly what they were talking about. And again, this is a direct quote, which I was surprised by when I first read it. Again, quoting, quote, "We are referring, of course, to the ignorant Mexican vote. We speak in plain English, and discussing the question from the plane of political interests of the legislators, what have they to fear from the Mexican vote in any event? It is a notorious fact that the Mexicans of the ignorant and migratory class, the class which should be denied the franchise, do not vote unless they are paid for their votes." So, pretty clear there what's going on. And so then this became, a cause celeb that the Arizona Republican newspaper in particular was pushing. And in 1909, there was an English-only restriction passed. It was a literacy test, similar to what was going on in the Jim Crow South at the time, that required a voter to read a section of the Constitution in English. And it was very deliberately intended to keep Spanish speakers primarily, but also obviously, figures of any other language from voting to restrict the vote to white people only. And really interesting, Farzan kind of uncovered this in her article, and I recommend it. When statehood happened in 1912, there was this restriction was actually put into the original draft of the state constitution, but was stripped out by Congress. Congress said, no, you can't do that because it violates the 15th Amendment. But then the Constitution was ratified. We were brought in as a state. Immediately after that, the state legislature puts the rule back on the books. And it stayed there, actually, as we will talk about, until 1972, 60 years. This was the law of the land in Arizona. So that was the primary mechanism of racist voter suppression in Arizona for most of the 20th century, was this English-only literacy requirement, which was aimed primarily at Spanish speakers, again, many of whom were here before this was the U.S., when it was still in Mexico, when we were still part of Mexico. After the border change, when they were, specifically, suppressed from voting. But then also, of course, in Arizona, we have a large indigenous population, and there's a whole kind of parallel track of suppression of their votes, which starts with the fact that until 1924, Native Americans were not considered American citizens, and so therefore could not vote. They were considered citizens of their sovereign nations. Both the federal government and state governments have this great history of recognizing indigenous sovereignty when it suits them, and then not, when it does not suit them. But in order to exclude them from voting, they were considered not citizens of the U.S. Congress passes a law in 1924 that changes that. The Indian Citizenship Act officially makes Native Americans citizens of the U.S. But Arizona doesn't stop there. They continue. And there's a systematic attempt to further restrict Native American voters that comes from the governor, the famous Governor Hunt, the first and longest serving governor of Arizona, came from his office, where they tried to declare that Native Americans were, quote, wards of the nation and therefore ineligible to vote. There is a state Supreme Court case in 1928 that upholds this ruling, restricting them from voting, and that goes all the way until 1948, 20 years later, when there's a Supreme Court case that finally says, no, Native Americans are citizens, they have the right to vote. But then, of course, even after that, you still have the English-only requirement in place, and large percentage of the Native population does not speak English, and so they were still restricted, in that way as well. And this was voting in Arizona from the time of statehood in 1912 up until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act. And so, we see a lot of the same kind of things that were going on in the Jim Crow South. Similarly to the Jim Crow South, this whole English-only requirement was enforced very sparingly. It was typically left to the county registrars, recorders to enforce this. And if you showed up and you looked white, you probably wouldn't even have to do it. You would just be allowed to vote. But if someone, quote unquote, looked like they didn't speak English, then this would be enforced. And one thing that's important to note here as well is that a lot of these restrictions were being pushed by the Democratic Party. So, as probably a lot of you are familiar with, when it comes to kind of race in general and voting in particular, the polarities of the parties get very complicated as we go into history. The Democratic Party post-Civil War was the party of the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow South was essentially a one-party state, for about 100 years. Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy, voter suppression, and a lot of those Democrats after the Civil War actually came to Arizona. So the Arizona Democratic Party was very similar in this, and they pushed these laws. But then as we go into the 50s and 60s, this is where the polarities start to change a little bit. The northern and then some western parts of the Democratic Party start to include more non-white people. And of course, in the Kennedy and then Johnson administrations, it's where we get the push for civil rights from the Democratic Party, which causes this whole flip to happen to what we see now, where Democratic Party is the party of multiracial democracy. The Republican Party is the party of white supremacy. And Arizona plays a role in this. The 1964 election, of course, this is when Arizona's own Barry Goldwater, runs for president, largely on opposition to the Civil Rights Act that was passed and signed by Lyndon Johnson. In 1962, during a Senate hearing, Goldwater had argued in favor of the literacy test in Arizona, arguing that the English-only restriction was appropriate and should stay in place. 1964 campaigns very heavily against the Civil Rights Act, becomes the first candidate to be endorsed by the KKK, notoriously. And so in this period, you start seeing the Republican Party start to use voter suppression for its own ends. And that takes me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is Operation Eagle Eye. So in the early 60s, the Republican Party in certain places starts to basically try to strategically use voter suppression with this program called Operation Eagle Eye, which they use primarily in the 1962 and the 1964 elections, where they would send quote unquote poll watchers out to the polls, theoretically to make sure regulations were being followed, but in reality to prevent people who they didn't think would vote Republican from voting. And largely those people were in certain areas, Black Americans, and then also Spanish speakers, Mexican Americans, especially here in Arizona. And so Phoenix becomes a big part of this Operation Eagle Eye program, which is all over the country. For the 1964 election, there was about 100,000 of these trained Republican workers around the country whose job was to go both intimidate voters by just their presence, but also challenge the registrations and the eligibility of any voters that they did not want voting. And so what that meant in Arizona was making sure that English-only literacy test requirement was enforced for any voter that looked like, they weren't going to vote Republican, essentially. And one really interesting note on this story, and part of the reason it is, still fairly well known, is in this period in the early 60s, when this Operation Eagle Eye program was in place, one of the Republican poll watchers here in Arizona who would go to polling places in South Phoenix, in the largely Black and Latino neighborhoods in South Phoenix, and would challenge these voters both to, again, intimidate them from voting, also just to slow down the lines so that the lines, took longer and, you could turn people away that way. One of those folks that did that was a young lawyer whose name was William Rehnquist, who would later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this became an issue when Rehnquist went up to become Chief Justice in the 80s. This is when this kind of came to light that he had been involved in this program, but it, unfortunately did not prevent him from becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And if you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about Chief Justice John Roberts, who has made it really his life's goal to completely eviscerate the Voting Rights Act. So it's an interesting theme in this series of, Chief Justices of the Supreme Court being absolutely terrible. And we're going to come back next week and talk about John Roberts some more and why he is terrible as well. Roberts was Rehnquist's successor in that role. And so that's where we are when the Voting Rights Act passes, is we have this English-only requirement. We have these poll watchers like William Rehnquist that are trying to use that requirement as a weapon to suppress voters specifically. And so the Voting Rights Act gets passed in 1965. There's this kind of weird thing with the act when it is first passed around the literacy test part in particular, in that it was unclear if literacy tests were constitutional or not, if you can believe that. And so the original version of the act could not ban literacy tests directly themselves. So instead, that Section 4 pre-clearance provision One of the ways you got put into Section 4 is if you had a, quote, test or device, such as a literacy test, that restricted voting registration and had voter registration of less than 50%. So they couldn't just do the literacy test. It also had to be jurisdictions that had low voter registration overall. And 3 Arizona counties, Apache, Coconino, and Navajo, fit that description in 1965 and were included in that restriction. A few years after that, there is a Supreme Court case that does ban literacy tests. It does say literacy tests are unconstitutional. The 1970 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act bans them entirely. But interestingly, Arizona still puts up a fight on this. They still take this to the court again after the 1970 authorization of the Voting Rights Act, get shot down by the Supreme Court in 1972 and finally repeal it then. So it was off the books, but that still took even 2 years after it was banned officially at the nationwide level. And it was largely because of that, because of the refusal to give up the literacy test, that in 1975, all of Arizona gets covered under the Section 4 provision, which meant that starting in 1975, in every county in Arizona, and also at the state level, at the state legislature level, any changes to voting procedures had to go through this pre-clearance process with the Department of Justice. And that kind of takes us up to, at least to 2013, which is what I'm going to get in next week. Again, if you got any questions on any of this, feel free to throw them in the chat right now. I'm happy to take a few questions. But yeah, this basically takes us to where we are at currently. So Arizona gets covered under this pre-clearance provision, and it is fairly successful. Voter registration rates go up. Arizona, in a lot of ways, has become, at least until recently, a model in how we do elections with things like the permanent early voting list and other things like that make it easier to vote. And that takes us up till 2013 and the Shelby County decision, where John Roberts, coming back again, strikes down the Section 4 provision of the Voting Rights Act, which then, of course, invalidates Section 5 as well and gets rid of the pre-clearance provision. And that is super important for what's going on right now. If the Shelby County decision had not happened, if the pre-clearance provision was still in place, these things that we see happening in the state legislature right now, we've seen bills this session requiring that people who vote by mail get their vote by mail ballot notarized. We've seen, restrictions to kick people off the permanent early voting list, to get rid of the permanent part of the Pebble, basically. There was a bill in the legislature to take the ability to pick presidential electors away from the voters and give it to the state legislature. All of those provisions, or at least a large portion of those, would not even have a chance of getting into place if Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was still in place, because they would never pass pre-clearance. It was only because of what happened in 2013 with the Shelby County decision that really opened this floodgate, both there in Arizona and around the country, for all these voter restriction laws that we're seeing. We've seen the stuff in Florida, Florida as well, but also Georgia, Texas. All these are or were Section 4 areas that would have been covered by pre-clearance, but because of Shelby County, now are allowed to do whatever they want. And that's why Shelby County has been called the 21st century Dred Scott decision. And so next week, I want to really get into Shelby County in a lot of detail about what it did, why it is such a horrible decision, both in its effects, but also just in its legal reasoning. It's just a ridiculous decision, just from a legal reasoning standpoint. And then also next week, I want to talk about another case that is at the Supreme Court right now. They just had oral arguments about a month ago. And this is the case with a name that you might recognize, which is Brnovich versus DNC, which is our own Mark Brnovich, the Attorney General. And this is a suit that was originated from a law that the legislature passed a few years ago, which a lot of you probably are familiar with, which restricted the ability to turn in a PEVL, an early vote ballot, for someone else. It prevented anyone from turning in someone else's ballot unless you were an immediate family member. It was directly targeted at these groups here in Arizona that would go into largely Latino communities, Black communities, other areas, areas with lots of seniors, basically where people had a hard time, getting to be able to turn their ballot back, getting to a post office, and would collect the ballots and turn them in for them. And because Republicans saw this as a strategic disadvantage, they passed a law banning this practice. And so that suit is at the Supreme Court right now. There is a lot of concern that John Roberts and the other 5 wingnut conservatives are on the court now are going to use this, as a reasoning to now go back and gut Section 2, that ability to bring a lawsuit, based on discriminatory practices. And so we're going to talk about that next week. Also talk about, what to do about it. But the biggest thing for this week, kind of the takeaway. So as we've seen, the Voting Rights Act, when it was in place before it got gutted in 2013, really did a lot, both here in Arizona and around the country. As a lot of you are probably aware, there are 2 big pieces of legislation: the HR 1, the For the People Act, and what is known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that have passed the House of Representatives in Washington, that would basically reinstate a lot of the Voting Rights Act, go even beyond that, to protect the right to vote around the country. And once again, Arizona is playing a big role here because those bills have passed the House and they, are awaiting a vote in the Senate, but have no chance of passing the Senate as long as the filibuster is in place. And our own Kirsten Sinema, of course, has become, her and Joe Manchin are the 2 big Democrats that are blocking reforming or getting rid of the filibuster and allowing Mitch McConnell to essentially have veto power over the entire legislative agenda. And so that is where we're at right now. And that is why, all of this is super important, because without those going into place, these state legislatures, including here in Arizona, just have the, carte blanche to run wild with these voting restrictions. And so that's why we need our Senator Sinema and the rest of the Senate to really do something about this. All right, so that is what I have for you for tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was informative. And if you want to know more about this stuff, definitely you can subscribe. I'm going to do the cliche YouTube thing now. I apologize. Subscribe to this to our channel on YouTube. We're going to be coming back with these pretty regularly. Like I said, you can check out our first video on there. You can follow us, White Hat Research and Policy Group, on all of your social media platforms. And, you can kind of continue to stay informed as we go forward over these next few months, which are going to be very critical for what happens with the 2022 election and beyond. And, our ability to protect our right to vote and not go backwards into, a new Jim Crow era. So thank you so much for joining me. Have a great night. I'll see you next time.